know this video is going to get some commentary. Hello adventurers! I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman whose accent disappeared in a freak magical accident. D&D is a sword and sorcery game, and it has always been about enabling all aspects of that fantasy for the players. However, recently, especially with the 2024 redesign, it feels like it's becoming a little too dependent on that sorcery side of things. Between the Barbarian's primal knowledge feature being a abstract primal power that seems to fuel stealth checks among other things, or the cleric's divine intervention becoming limited to codified magic spells instead of the creative sandbox that it had previously. To me, it feels like the writing team are becoming a little too reliant on magic, and specifically their version of the Vancian system, when it comes to describing how or why certain things appear in the game. And I firmly believe this is having an impact on the game both now and in the future. 5e gained a moniker for being the second best system for any kind of fantasy game. Except now, with magic threaded through the very existence of the system and the lore, it's going to become a lot harder to tell certain types of genres and stories. Can you easily tell a crime noir fantasy story when magic solves all of the crimes? Can you achieve a low magic setting when the ranger's tracking skills are intertwined with their spell slots? I think it's time we as a community had a discussion about magic in D&D, the over-reliance the design team seem to be having with it, and the impact it's inadvertently having on the kinds of stories we want to tell. This video is going to be a little bit of a rant on my part, but I want to be upfront. This isn't about being anti-D&D as a system overall, but it's about questioning the direction that it's been heading in and whether it is right for us. This is just a chance to understand how the game is being impacted both mechanically and narratively, and how those two elements interact with each other and impact us as the players. I don't want this to become an anti-D&D video, so before you start dropping comments early, watch the whole thing through, and I will be interested to hear your opinions nonetheless. But let's try to focus on what the impact is having rather than just bashing the system as a whole. With that clause out of the way, let's begin. Before we get into the weeds of this discussion, it is worth establishing the baseline of what is D&D's magic system. The term Vancian magic is thrown around fairly loosely in D&D circles, but D&D hasn't represented the system presented in those books in an awfully long time. It's mutated and evolved over the decades to better suit modern gaming standards and player satisfaction at the table, removing a lot of the frustration and limitations that the Vancian system imposed in the early years. I prefer to call D&D's system Neo-Vancian now. It's got a lot more flexible in what players can do with it, but it still has that beating core of preparing and learning spells to then cast them. The big thing the system does is it prevents a uniform method of preparing and casting spells, regardless of the source of which your magic comes from. Divine casters cast magic in exactly the same way as arcane casters when you get down to the mechanics. And then within those subcategories, there is no difference from, say, wizards and sorcerers in how they actively cast their spells. Yes, you can flavour it however you want, but if you get down to the brass tacks of the system, bards are casting the same as sorcerers, are casting the same as wizards. And to be clear, none of this is bad, it just is what the system is. So we can see from this that the system is incredibly codified and removes a lot of the flexibility and potential creativity in how you can use magic within the system, which in turn impinges on our narrative creativity in the process. As an example, we can compare to how casting spells works in a game like Warhammer. Warhammer has a chance-based casting mechanic, which showcases the narrative of that world that casting magic is both risky and dangerous. Not only will you possibly not do what you're trying to do, but if you do badly enough, it's going to come back to hurt you because the powers involved want you to suffer. Or conversely, compare it to Fate, which is a deliberate open sandbox and just tells people to go wild with their creativity. And neither of these systems are necessarily better than the others, but it's just an example of how we can use different mechanics to showcase different kinds of magic within our worlds. And we must consider how our stories are shaped by those mechanics. Circling back to 2024 5th edition, my issue is not that the magic system itself is strict and codified, but that strict nature is starting to leak into other elements of the game, further restricting what players can do and the creativity we can have. There is a proliferation of magic and spells being used to write class features and other mechanics, and likewise those mechanics that already existed being written as using magic in a way to justify their existence and how they work. You can see this with monsters in the new monster manual, where the magical weapons feature is now gone, replaced with force damage. That is fine contextually, but you have to think about the impact that has on other elements. Is force damage now just a catch-all term for any magical weapon damage? Why don't the player's +1 swords now deal force damage? We live in a dichotomy of options in that space that not only muddies the water, but imposes restrictions. What if I'm using a magical creature that its attacks are more necrotic in my head because of the narrative, but are dealing force damage? What about my barbarian, who is not resistant to force damage, but is getting punched by a demon of some kind? Why is that demon's attacks able to overcome the barbarian's toughness of spirit and mind? Similarly, dragons, no longer naturally terrifying. Instead, in the rules, they cast the fear spell to invoke that frightening presence effect that they had in 2014. Which is fine. Mechanically, there is some logic to that of trying to slim down the rules and keep everything in a single version of this fear effect. But it means that the dragon is not terrifying in its own aspect, it is only its ability to cast spells that makes it frightening. Technically, a dragon can now be counterspelled when it's trying to be frightening. Meanwhile, at a player level, barbarians use an esoteric, undefined primal power that is written as if it is magical. Rangers no longer know how to track a creature or where its weak spots are through years of training and experience. They cast the Hunter's Mark spell. Only magic makes them good at what they do. And then we see the magic action everywhere. Now, I firmly believe the magic action is a great addition to the game to just better clarify how certain things happen, but you see it everywhere for a lot of things that possibly don't need to be defined as a magic action. All it's doing is defining these things as only existing because of the magic in the world and the spells that are being cast within that. What we've seen is across the board an expansion of the use of magic to explain how D&D works. And while there is an argument that this is to streamline and make the game more easy to digest, we can't ignore the impact that it's having on the worlds we're creating and the ways in which we can tell stories. Now we're all on the same page as to what magic is in D&D, what does this mean narratively? A while ago, over on Blue Sky, I started a thread about how Neovansian magic imposes on our world building and storytelling due to its precise, dependable and consistent nature. Magic in D&D is perfectly safe. You cannot get the casting of a spell wrong. You either cast the spell or you don't. There is no in between. There's no gradation to casting a spell where you kind of get 80% of the way there, but you're not fully in control of the fireball and its range is a little off, a little smaller or a little bigger and it accidentally catches your friends. And this is great for player satisfaction, but is it interesting? A common trope in fantasy, especially dark and gritty fantasy, is that the general populace are afraid of magic. Except in a setting dictated by the rule system where magic is perfectly safe, a binary pass-fail as to whether it works as intended, then it's a bit irrational to be afraid of magic itself. Ultimately, you can only be afraid of those who wield magic and the terrible things they might do with that power they have gained. There's nothing within the system that allows you to do a half cast of a spell that goes dangerously wrong, a well-intended mage trying to help the populace that accidentally causes a building to go on fire. Nor can you have any harm come back to the caster themselves for pushing magic too far. And on a similar note, you can't showcase, mechanically, a mage who isn't in full control of their powers and is still learning to harness the magic inside them. If you throw in the concept that magic lives in these discrete energy bands that casters figure out the next energy level every so often, it's very hard to showcase how someone steadily learns magic and gets more powerful, instead achieving these almost quantum leaps to the next stage of power arbitrarily. One day you're incapable of casting spells at all, the next day you're casting cantrips at will and summoning ice knives to slay goblins. There's no subtlety to magic progression in D&D. Now, moving away from the exact mechanical system of magic in D&D, the existence of magic to describe class features imposes its own restrictions on our storytelling. If magic is overtly everywhere, in everything the adventurers do, regardless of their class, it becomes quite difficult to tell low magic, dark storytelling, or even subtle magic storytelling like Tolkien's Middle-earth. For us DMs and world builders, if a class feature uses the magic action or even just describes it in a magical way, it becomes really hard to establish a world in which magic is rare or hard to obtain. And you risk some disconnect between the setting you're trying to establish and the things that the players can do. The setting being used in the current Unrolled Stories campaign has an empire founded on the concept of controlling magic. Except in 5.5e, the line between what's magic and what's not has been blurred. Are Dragonborn magic? Now, considering they channel magic to grow wings and they exhale magical energy for their breath weapon. That is verbatim from the player's handbook. In my opinion, those descriptions are somewhat unnecessary. Dragonborn were cool when their physiology was the thing that allowed them to breathe fire. We're losing a little bit of the touch of fantasy world building when everything becomes about magic because we don't have a separator between Dragonborns and humans other than the fact that seemingly Dragonborns can innately channel magic in directed ways. An abundance of magic is not necessarily bad, it is really fun in high magic settings, but D&D likes to build itself on being the system for any story you want to tell, and with this much magic in it, I don't think that's true anymore. Overall, I feel this shift to everything is magic, at its root, is boring and uninspiring. What happened to inspiring GMs and players to be creative and to create their own worlds and their own descriptions for the events within there? And why in those explanations is it simultaneously incredibly specific, but also incredibly vague? Saying something exists because of magic is both limiting to your creative process, but also not specific and doesn't actually answer the question. Game systems that explain what happens but not why open the door to world builders to create their own explanations and build fantastical settings that draw players into play. There is an aspect of wonder and fun in developing your own reasons for certain game mechanics existing. Maybe in your setting, dragons really are casting the fear spell to spread this aura that they are terrifying. But for me, I personally prefer the idea that dragons are so ancient they are coded into the hindbrain of humanoid creatures to be terrified of them from prehistoric times. It just makes them more mythical, in my opinion. Both ideas are cool, but when it comes to 2024's exact writing, only one of them is actually canon. Enough about the narrative though, because at the end of the day we can kind of circumnavigate those issues if we actually try hard enough. Let's instead discuss the over-reliance on magic as a concept when it comes to the actual mechanical structure of the system of 5e. My genuine concern is that it's going to hinder the innovation and creativity of the design team when it comes to making new subclasses, new campaign setting ideas, and new features overall. Over the last decade, we have seen some third-party publishers be incredibly creative with the 5e engine, coming up with great additional mechanics that expand and explore the game in new ways. MCDM released The Talent, a psionic class that fundamentally produced a spell-like system that was divorced from the spellcasting mechanic as presented in 5e. It was innovative and it was exciting, and it made people see that there were other ways you could play this game. Critical Role's Bloodhunter, while yes, flawed, explored a way to do debilitating effects without the use of the spellcasting system. The Blood Maledict system gave players a way to debuff their enemies without just casting a spell at the root cause. Innovation like this is key to keeping a game alive, and I worry that the design team at Wizards aren't going to be able to push beyond the envelope because they're confining themselves to the existing system already. Nothing in the 2024 5th edition felt innovative to me. It felt more like everything was being pulled back to this grey mean to make sure everything was balanced and equal. Back in 3rd edition, the psionic systems and martial maneuvers books were created by having a design team that felt empowered to push the system to its limits and go beyond what was safe and codified. Free to play with the established basic game loop in a way that felt exciting to them and potentially players. And it just doesn't feel like the 5e team are willing to push that envelope. I genuinely fear that the design team are so wrapped up in Magic being their special sauce that we're not going to see anything innovative from them in the near future. And we've been seeing this in the latest Unearthed Arcanas for the Artificer and the Forgotten Realms. The Purple Dragon Knight is a concept of the chivalric knight from Arthurian legend, a leader of men and a diplomat second. And while it was poorly executed in 2014, it is an interesting narrative concept that a lot of people would find fun playing. Unfortunately, as we've seen in the Unearthed Arcana, it's now about having a magical bond with a dragon. Again, not a bad concept, but a shift from interesting to just doing magic. Elsewhere, the Knowledge Domain Cleric only is smart because of spells that they have. The Winter Walker Ranger could have been about being able to traverse cold environments, but is instead about becoming a magical terror of frost. And then we have the Artificer, which, yes, I do understand, kind of has to use magic quite a lot, but it doesn't need everything about it to be magical. The ability to produce a common item like thieves' tools or any other tools or some rope when needed is a fun concept. I always envisioned it of them just having a bag full of random scrap that they could figure out how to bolt together MacGyver style to use. In the Unearthed Arcana though, it's they magically conjure this thing from nothing and it eventually disappears at the end of the day. When I saw the new Artificer subclass, the Cartographer, I was really excited. It sounded like a fresh new idea that they were going to explore a new way of the Artificer. Except, mechanically, it just ended up being about being able to teleport and to cast a bunch more spells, like all of the other Artificer subclasses. It didn't feel new and interesting, it just felt like a different way to flavour my Artificer casts an arcane spell. The concept opened the door for something innovative and fresh, and it ended up feeling the same as everything else we've been presented with so far. Yes, this class is about magic, but it showcases this reliance on magic as a deus ex machina for explaining things, rather than exploring other elements of a class's core fantasy to come up with features. This might just be my perception. The magic action is new and I keep seeing it everywhere to describe a bunch of actions, and maybe it's actually not all that bad. But there is an argument that perception matters when you're setting the tone of a game. D&D, any TTRPG, should want to expand and evolve and adopt new ideas. And instead, we're heading towards this millennial grey sludge of magical gruel. Anyway, enough complaining. What can we do about it? How can we continue to use 5e in all of the ways we like? Well, the first answer is don't. Go and explore other systems instead. D&D isn't the only system out there for telling fantasy stories. I'm sure there's going to be 17 comments below telling me all about Pathfinder. Yes, I have played it. I don't enjoy it as much as D&D. That's besides the point. But there are other systems as well, like Shadow of the Weird Wizard and Shadowdark as well, that are both harkening back to that D&D fantasy, but done in completely different ways. Ironically, the system I'm most looking forward to in that fantasy swords and sorcery aspect is Daggerheart, which actually leans further into magic than D&D currently does, but it's intentional about it. It knows what it's doing and leans into that aspect rather than trying to hide it. But let's say we still want to play D&D, it's what our players like, so what do we do? The obvious and honestly probably correct answer that I'm sure some people will tell me in the comments is ignore this problem. This doesn't actually matter and only bothers weirdos on the internet. And to be honest, I kind of agree. I can compartmentalize this issue when I'm running games and I've not found it to bother me in the D&D games I've played recently. But then again, I've not really played much of 2024 5e, so maybe it'll bother me much more in the future. If you are looking to tell lower magical stories, exploring third-party options is a great way to do this. Dungeons of Drakkenheim by the Dungeon Dudes and Grim Hollow by Ghostfire Gaming are both great source books for inspiring you in how to create those kind of games. And I would also recommend checking out Oxventure's recent Weirdwood season where Johnny Chiodini, the GM, introduced a really fun mechanic that showcased how magic was actually dangerous and would always have its due. These kind of subtle, inobtrusive ways of shifting 5th edition into a different format are great for these kind of games, because they're much easier to remember and they don't feel like they interfere with the game loop quite as much. Alternatively to all of this, you could just commit to the bit, something the 5e designers don't actually seem to be doing, which is probably what annoys me more. Lean into the idea that every adventurer is magical and powered by the weave, and they are distinctly other from the commoners of the world. Could you imagine if the designers actually lent into this idea when it came to martials, being empowered by magic to achieve things that no mortal, sane human being could do? And we just got rid of the pretense of a guy with a sword and shield being able to stand up to an archmage hurling meteors at them. For the record though, I do kind of like that trope of a stubborn human fighter standing up against this powerful, almost demigod mage. It's kind of fun. But that's besides the point. Let martials become Hercules, Gilgamesh, or your favourite anime character. Absolutely reality-breaking combat speed and ferocity. Strength that can rival the gods and wielding powers that would make mortals weep. I've recently been musing on a concept for a setting where adventurers become an adventurer by experiencing a snapping event. That moment where a commoner suddenly becomes capable of accessing the power of magic and doing great things with it. Almost similar to that trope that occasionally goes around where the reason adventurers actually get more powerful is because they're going all over the realms and going to sites of powerful magic or crossing ley lines, and that seems to power them up. What does the world look like with these two different castes of people? The common folk who fundamentally outnumber the others are the thing that keeps the world turning and are the normal everyday man, and the handful of selected people capable of using magic to control the world, dictate their own whims, and ultimately the only thing holding them back is their moral compass. Do they use it for good or for tyranny, and how do they keep each other in check? The point I'm trying to make is sometimes it is best to go with what the game is giving you and just explore what it means for a setting you come up with. And maybe it is time to admit that 5th edition is no longer the second best system for any kind of fantasy game, and instead we should focus on what it does well. And ultimately, that's why the rules of a system exist. They tell us how the world works for the game we are playing, the rules of reality we must obey. It is just our responsibility to figure out what that actually means in a story. Look, at the end of the day, this probably doesn't matter to 90% of people playing D&D, and I would kind of hope it doesn't. But I do think it's something that GMs and game designers need to be conscious of. Whether it's understanding how Neovancian mechanics intertwine with the kind of stories we want to tell, or with how the mechanics of 5.5e are becoming intertwined with the spellcasting subsystem, and whether we should be exploring other opportunities. I am probably overthinking this. I still do enjoy playing D&D every time I get opportunity to, but the more I read into 2024 5e, the less enthused I become to play it. I mean, what do you think? Have you switched to 2024 rules yet? Are you enjoying it? Is it more than I think it is? Do magic systems actually matter that much to the storytelling we're doing within the game? Let me know in the comments below your thoughts, and feel free to suggest your preferred system outside of D&D 5th edition and why its magic system actually is much better than Neovancian, because I'm sure some of you are going to have some opinions. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. It does help appease the magical algorithm that has intertwined itself with the entire system. And if you enjoyed this kind of content, feel free to hit subscribe and hit the bell notification to make sure you never miss a video. Anyway, I do believe that's it. I've yelled into the void about a pointless topic for long enough. I don't intend for this to become a common thing on the channel, but hey, if you enjoy it, maybe I'll find another thing that annoys me about D&D or other TTRPGs. With all of that said, we are done here. So, until we do this again, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go see whether a Dispel magic will bring my accent back. And remember to keep telling stories. Oof, I don't think I realised quite how much that all bothered me. People are either going to agree with me or really hate me.